sponsor, I move that we recognize the patriot and nationalist from the party list Magdalo, the Honorable Gary Alejano. So move, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor.
The Honorable Alejano is recognized for his interpellation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good evening to everyone. Before I proceed with my questions, I just would like to greet the sponsor a happy birthday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor. It has been such a momentous birthday in Congress, Mr. Speaker. It has been such a long and wonderful and very eventful day. Mr. Speaker, Your Honor, if I may, the National Security Council, together with the National Intelligence Coordinating Agency, are considered one of the most pivotal and instrumental agencies in securing national peace, safety, and the ultimate well-being of the Filipino people. This year's 2016 budget for NSC is 139.807 million pesos, and for NICA, 606.996 million pesos, Mr. Speaker, truly raises the banner high for the country as we ensure the gains of our democracy. This sponsor, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, is now ready for the interpellation. And thank you for the greeting, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
You're welcome, Mr. Sponsor. Mr. Speaker, can I proceed with my questions?
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just have some few questions. First, I just would like to ask our sponsor if he's aware of a document called the National Security Policy 2011-2016.
Yes, Your Honor. As a matter of fact, I have a copy of this document, which is entitled National Security Policy and Securing the Gains of Democracy, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's correct. Is the National Security Council responsible for the crafting of this document?
Yes, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker. The National Security Council was very instrumental in crafting this national security policy. As a matter of fact, for the past so many years, although there has been a national security policy, but it has never been printed. And through the National Security Council, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, this administration is the first one who has printed out and given copies to all people, which is a very laudable effort as we see the vision of this administration as we move forward with regard national security policy, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. For the record, Mr. Speaker, may I request the Mr. Sponsor to state the national security policy, the goals and objectives?
Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, as a matter of policy, the state shall undertake the necessary steps to ensure that the Filipino national community's welfare, well-being, ways of life, institutions, territorial integrity, and sovereignty are enhanced and protected. Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
That's correct, Mr. Sponsor, the national security policy. And how about the national security goals, Mr. Sponsor?
There are mainly two goals, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, as we talk about the goals of the national security policy. First is to promote internal socio-political stability, and the second one is to capacitate the country to exercise full sovereignty over its territory and to provide protection to its maritime and other strategic interests. Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. The reason why I requested the sponsor to state the national security policy goals and objectives, because not all of the Filipinos, not only Filipinos, but government officials understand and know these national security policy goals and objectives. And in relation to that, Mr. Speaker, would you agree that the national security is not only the responsibility of our defense and security agencies, but of the entire Filipino citizenry?
Yes, of course, Your Honor, Mr. Chairman. As a matter of fact, each individual, each Filipino citizen is entitled and is privileged to have a sense of wholeness and well-being as we all together fight security as an individual and as a nation as a whole, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Mr. Sponsor. Therefore, you would agree that even the private sector should be aware of this stated national security policy, goals, and objectives.
Yes, Your Honor, as much as the private individual and citizens are involved, the counterparts in the public sector should also be involved as well, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. Now we have this document called National Security Policy. Do you think, Mr. Sponsor, this is enough to clearly guide our stakeholders, especially our public sectors, in crafting their programs, activities, and projects?
Yes, as a matter of fact, this is our, so to speak, lighthouse, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker. And this is a good guide, good vision that we should encourage even for the next administration to continue, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. Just a query, Mr. Sponsor. Would you be able to differentiate between a national security policy and a national security strategy?
So to speak, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, policy is the guidelines, is the regulations, the vision. And strategy, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, is the end goal, ways and means, execution, implementation, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. Yes, in general, I understand that policy is an intent or the executive intent, while strategy is on the how this intent will be materialized, Mr. Sponsor. I asked that question because I want to clarify if we have a national security strategy.
Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, for the moment, as of the present situation, Your Honor, the policy is being crafted and being regularly amended by the National Security Council. However, the strategy for the operations of these policies, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, is being executed by the different agencies, for example, the ND, AFP, PNP, so on and so forth, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, because so far, when I tried to find documents on national security strategy, we don't have any. I just would like to cite a document, the Memorandum Order Number 6 by the President of the Republic of the Philippines. Upon the assumption of the Aquino administration, it states here that National Security Advisor and National Security Council is directed to come up with a national security policy and national security strategy. And there was specific timeline within which this document should be submitted. The national security policy should be submitted on November 2010. And the national security strategy should be submitted on or before April of 30, 2011. Nasunod po ba ito, Mr. Sponsor?
Well, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, the national security policy was done during the time frame that was allotted to it. However, with regard to strategy, it was not executed because of the different changes and adjustments needed to be made, because this is the first time that we have done a project as big as this. So what the executive did was to charge the different agencies, as was mentioned earlier, that the ND, AFP, PNP, to do the execution and the strategy, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. Anyway, I asked that so that we can really identify policy and the difference between the policy and strategy. Nonetheless, I just would like to ask if all of our government agencies, aside from what you've stated, aware or if not mandated to consider, incorporate national security policy objectives and goals and the crafting of their programs, activities, and projects. Because as discussed earlier, national security is the responsibility of everybody, especially
Your Honor.
government agency. And that, if that is the case, are they aware of stated national security policy goals and objectives?
Yes, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, I share the sentiment of the Honorable Congressman. Each individual in the country should have a stake in national security. And of course, all the different agencies have been given copies of the memorandums as well as the copies of the national security policy, that everyone should be a stakeholder in defining our national security policy, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
So I just would like to clarify, they were given copies or memorandums related to national security policy. Can I ask for a specific steps or actions taken to inform or educate our government agencies? Not only that, but the whole Filipino citizenry.
Since 2011, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, until the present, all agencies have been briefed and continually been educated with regard to national security policy, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. Ang atin lang pong ikinababahala or kinakatakot dahil yung national security policy ay para lamang nice-to-know document na kung saan pag nabasa na po ng mga agencies, maganda ito okay ito. But are they really aware of their taskings, of their mandate, and the achievement of the national security policy, objectives, and goals? Kasi po, when I was still, when I was a civilian, or before I entered Congress, I already read the document, and I don't want to mention the office, but I just read the document, and you know, it remained a document, and it was not really appreciated and implemented.
Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, that is a very good point. While we can appreciate so much the documents and appreciate so much the crafting and the wording and so on and so forth, sometimes we neglect that the more important meat of the matter should be the implementation and not just remain in paper, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Sponsor and Mr. Speaker. I asked that question because how about if because there's no clear tasking on them on the achievement of security policy goals and objectives, how about if they will not comply or incorporate or consider national security policy in their programs and projects? Is there any sanction regarding to the non-compliance?
Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, Honorable Congressman from Magdalo, we also share in that very notable observation. While the document is well prepared and has been written beautifully, if an agency isn't able to perform the execution of such activities related to securing the national policies on security, there are no sanctions to be talked about for the matter, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker. So that is why we submit to the observations to the Honorable Congressman that we may revise or amend the national security policy so that it may really be not just a document but rather a solid agreement between agencies that we are all stakeholders in the national security process, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. Kaya nga po, tinanong ko kanina, the difference between policy and strategy. Because strategy, it talks on how this policy will be carried out or will be given specific taskings, no? So to different government agencies, even for the private sector. Kaya ko po na-raise din yan because during the deliberation of the budget of some of the agencies of the government, I asked them, specifically the Department of Agriculture, the Office of Food Security and Modernization, I asked them if they're aware of such document, the National Security Policy. Nagtitingin na lang po sila, no? Hindi po nila alam. Nagtatanungan po sila, at sinabi po nilang titingnan nila at aalamin. So, in this case, the National Security Policy was crafted way back 2011, and we're now 2015 at the end of the term of this administration. And yet, some, and for that matter, many of the departments or agencies are not still aware of the National Security Policy. If they are not aware of this document, how can they be able to accomplish these stated policies, goals, and objectives? Kaya tinanong ko po, isang example lang gusto ko lang i-share po sa inyo, yung sa Department of Agriculture. If they don't consider security implications of their programs and projects, then these programs and projects might be taken advantage of by the so-called enemies of the state. Ang isang example po, during the 2000 Central Mindanao campaign, ang pondo po ng National Irrigation Agency or Authority ay ginamit po sa running trenches at bunkers ng MILF. Ayan ay ginamit laban sa gobyerno. Hindi po aware ang ating mga departments po dito. And marami pa po. Gusto ko lang tingnan. Ang Department of Interior and Local Government, kung hindi po sila aware sa security aspect ng kanilang trabaho, marami pong ating local government chief executives who are actually supporting the so-called enemies of the state. Kaya nga po napakahirap talunin ang sinasabi nating kalaban at napabayaan natin ang ating armed forces at ang ating PNP for themselves, to fend for themselves. And yet some of the agencies of the government are not cooperating with our security agencies because they're not aware of this document or they were not mandated to comply with the security objectives, policies, and goals. Kaya nga po, I have this document, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor. Yung sources of the CPP, NPA, NDF extortion activities by areas. In the year 2013, sa tingin ko lang po hindi kompleto ang data. The estimated amount that they have extorted amounted to 173,179,900. In the year 2014, napakalaki po. The total amount of the extorted money is 2,404,302,377. Just imagine, Mr. Speaker, malaki pa po ang pondo nila kaysa mga ahensya ng ating gobyerno. And nanggaling po ito saan? Mining, quarrying companies, agribusiness, fish pond owners, contribution from politicians. coming from their internal revenue allotments. Ako po alam ko, meron po mga barangay kapitan na hinihingian ang kanilang allowances at internal revenue allotment ng mga NPA. No? And also, construction companies, contractors, business commercial establishments, transport, moneyed private individual, telecom companies, and others. So ang sinasabi ko lang po, na napag-usapan natin kanina that national security is the responsibility of everybody, especially government officials. Sila din po ang nagbabayad o nagbibigay at nagsusuporta sa tinatawag nating kalaban ng Estado. Kung hindi po sila aware ng security implications, hindi po natin matatapos ang laban sa ating tinatawag na enemies of the state, Mr. Sponsor.
Thank you, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor. That is totally true and correct, Your Honor, when you first said that each individual is part of a stakeholder in ensuring the security of the nation. Much more so, Your Honor, Mr. Chairman, that a part of the body cannot be disaggregated from the body. The hand cannot be apart from the head and from the torso and so on and so forth, as each individual agency in government should work hand in hand, most especially when we talk about the national security issues and policies, Your Honor, Mr. Chairman. With regard to the concerns with extorted money, the agency has a rough estimate, Your Honor, Mr. Chairman, but for the moment, we are still checking the records on how much the real total cost of the extorted money is. But we yield to the Honorable Congressman that yes, this has been such a big problem because each individual agency is not putting forth as much effort as the different agencies with regard to national security policy. As much as the strategies which you have mentioned earlier, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, the National Security Council makes the policies and sometimes relies with DND, AFP, and PNP, and some other agencies, Your Honor, for the implementation. However, it should be of primordial importance that we should let other agencies be involved more with securing national security, and more so that we, all of the people in the nation, may be able to imbibe the gains of our democracy, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. I hope that government officials, especially head of agencies, should be aware of the threat to our national security, both internal and external. Because ito po yung nakikita ko Hinahayaan po natin yung APPNP at ang tinatawag nating enemies of the state, at yung iba po ay referee lang at observer. Hindi po nila alam, nakasama po sila sa gobyerno. Nakakalungkot po yan dahil merong mga pronouncement, even by local government officials, supporting the NPA, and yet wala po tayong kinakasuhan. Is this acceptable already in our system, that even government officials publicly supporting the so-called enemies of the state, and yet hindi po siya nasa-censure, hindi po siya nasa-sanction? I'm afraid we're sending a wrong signal to the Filipino people that it is okay to deal with the enemies of the state, and hayaan na natin ng APPNP na mag-struggle na i-resolve ito, Mr. Sponsor.
That is correct, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker. And we agree totally with the observations made by the Honorable Congressman. And this sponsor believes that there must be a conscious and deliberate effort by each and every department head and agency to align their policies, programs, projects to attain objectives in our national security policy, which are governance, good governance, delivery of basic services, economic reconstruction and sustainable development, and of course, security sector reform, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Sponsor. I think it is high time that Congress pass a law mandating the executive department through the office of the president to submit its national security strategy along with the annual proposed budget to Congress, so that they will be able, the executive department would be able to justify their proposed budget, especially on the fulfillment of national security policy goals and objectives. Because if we will not mandate them, then we will just be passive and be waiting kung gagawin ba nila ito o hindi. Kahit po sa ating mga ahensya, pasalamat tayo kung ginagawa nila ito. Kung hindi, wala po tayong magagawa. Mr. Sponsor, I am crafting a proposed law that will mandate the President to submit his national security strategy along with the proposed budget, because in the United States, in the Goldwater-Nichols Act, the President is required every year to submit a national security strategy along with the proposed budget. Because I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, meron na naman tayong mga national security situation na kung saan bulag po tayong lahat. The issues at West Philippine Sea will linger through the years. Kung hindi po tayo magkaroon ng maliwanag na security strategy, then we won't be able to instruct and guide our citizenry when it comes to national security. Example po, yung ating mga mangingisda, binobomba po ng mga Chinese Coast Guard and Chinese Navy. Hindi po nila alam kung anong gagawin. Hindi nila alam ano ang roles of engagement, because dapat po, I believe, gaya ng sabi ko kanina, that national security is the responsibility of everybody. And I believe with the issue at West Philippine Sea, by now, local governments in that area, affected areas, all the populace there, private sector, the business sector, they should by now be aware of their role in the total security picture of the situation. Mr. Speaker.
I totally agree. This representation totally agree with the recommendations by our honorable colleague. We need to pass, and it's more than just high time, that we need to pass a National Security Act. And with the recommendation by our honorable colleague, this representation would be the first one to co-author and champion, together with our dear colleague, a National Security Act, which will institutionalize the regular preparation of a national security strategy based on the comprehensive outline on vital national security concerns and challenges, and how the government plans to deal with them using the instruments of national power, to include a commitment on a national level to allocate budget resources to achieve our national security goals. Your Honor, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sponsor, for that support. And I know exactly, Mr. Sponsor, that in spite of the limitation, I understand that the National Security Council has been trying its best effort to comply with the mandates given to them by the people. And that, Mr. Sponsor, I actually congratulate the National Security Council and the National Security Advisor. I hope we can work to come up with what we have discussed tonight. And congratulations and good evening. Thank you very much, Mr. Sponsor, and happy birthday.
Thank you, Your Honor, Mr. Speaker. Yes, the National Security Council, together with Secretary Garcia, will be working hand in hand with your office and Congress, so that we can craft a bill, and hopefully into an act that will truly ensure a national security policy and strategy that will advance the gains of our democracy. Your Honor, Mr. Speaker, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good evening.
Thank you, Honorable Alejano.